Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Reagan King and joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. This evening we're going to be discussing the massive general election victory by Kier Stramer and the Labour Party that we were introducing essentially last week when we talked about the different parties that were running in this particular election, their different policies from a Christian perspective. Well, Labour has won. Some would prefer to say the Conservatives lost. Any way you cut it, we have a Labour supermajority, essentially. And what we're going to be discussing particularly are the important foreign policy issues and goals of this new administration. As the new Foreign Secretary David Lamy has labelled it a progressive realism British foreign policy, and we're going to be asking what on earth that means, a progressive realism British foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's edition of Behind the Headlines. It's important, Simon, that we ask this question and that we also look at whether or not there's going to be a progression of the globalist agenda and pressure on Israel.
No, absolutely. I mean, firstly, let's go through the general election results, because this essentially underpins the direction that the new Labour government will take. It will mean essentially that the Labour Party doesn't face a slim majority. So we know that whatever their legislative programme is, they should be able to get that into law easily without any trouble or without any opposition. So, and the same goes with foreign policy as well. So, as you know, the British public went to the polls on Thursday, the 4th of July, and the Labour Party won 411 seats, up by 209 seats from the previous general election under Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. And we also see that the Conservatives won only 121 seats, down from 244 from 2019, and a total of 365 seats. The Liberal Democrats gained 61 seats for a total of 72, and while the Scottish Party won 9 seats, down from 48 seats in 2009. So let's have a look at this excellent mini report put together by the Christian Institute that reflects on the general election result and the makeup of our new party, in which the Labour Party has a super massive majority in Parliament.
The UK has a new government. The Labour Party won a sizable majority with 34% of the vote, beating the Conservatives into second place. The Lib Dems are now the third largest party at Westminster. In Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin won the most seats. Labour has indicated what its policies are on several important moral issues, although some matters are devolved.
So this is the new makeup we have in our own Parliament here as well. I mean, Reagan, when it comes to foreign policy is so important, because this is Britain's policies towards the rest of the world, Britain's relationship with Europe, for example, how the British government will deal with the war in Ukraine, and for us Christians it's also about how this new Labour government will reach out to persecuted Christians in Islamic countries, how this nation will respond to the special relationship with the nation of Israel and all that goes with it. Will this nation be under a blessing or whether it will be under curse will all be determined by British foreign policy. But also the other issue as well is that we see that traditionally the Labour Party are more of a kind of globalist party, where we see greater cooperation between Britain and the European Union, and there's obviously big question marks to say, will the Labour Party and this Labour government give up more British sovereignty in order to forge closer ties with the European Union? And there's other issues such as this, is how does Britain respond to these global challenges? And this is why it's so important that we analyse and we reflect and look at the direction that British foreign policy will take under this new Labour administration.
Well, some of those other issues that we've talked about on the programs previously, China is very, very important. The ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, ongoing hot spots in the Middle East as well. These are massively live issues that are going to be critical for our government to respond to. They have no other option. They have to respond to these issues and to respond well. But it's important to consider the background of who our Foreign Secretary is, David Lamy. Previously, the MP of a constituency I lived in. He's been there for a significant length of time and is very, very popular in Tottenham. But this is how he describes himself on his website. Let's hear it from himself. He's the Member of Parliament for Tottenham and the Shadow Foreign Secretary. One of the leading agenda setters in the fields of social activism, diversity, and multiculturalism. He was a member of the previous Labour government between 2001 and 2010, and is respected across the party spectrum and is a well-known figure amongst the general public. He was Shadow Justice Secretary from April 2020 until November of 2021. I am a man of multiple identities, Londoner, English, patriotic Brit, proud of my Caribbean heritage, a transatlanticist, and throughout my political career, absolutely committed to a close partnership with our European neighbours. He goes on to describe himself as a well-known advocate of social activism, diversity, multiculturalism. David continues to tackle the big issues facing society on a macro and micro scale and provide tangible solutions to bring about effective change. So that's
I mean, but personally, who writes that about themselves? Maybe got other people to write about him, but firstly, yeah. I mean, it's good that he comes from a Caribbean background. And he's now in one of the highest offices of state as Foreign Secretary, which is an amazing achievement, and just shows you how much meritocracy we have in this country, which I think is very encouraging.
Where things have gone for good.
Absolutely, but the danger is, and this is what I'm concerned about the most, is that he talks about a champion of social activism. And also then talking about multiculturalism. Now, the biggest problem that the West has faced over the last 50 years or so has been the problem of multiculturalism.
Right.
Importing and exporting different faiths, different ethnic minorities into the country that don't share, for example, the values of our nation. And then in the extent we've had to water or virtually destroy our Judeo-Christian heritage at the expense of other religions and other ideologies that dominate the country. So multiculturalism on paper sounds like a good idea. It sounds like, oh, look, we can get on with different countries, different ethnicities, all living together nicely in a social cohesion of this utopian society, but it doesn't work, because what happens is that our own traditions, our own values get so watered down to accommodate these new values that we see that really that there are ethnic minorities and there are religious groups that are effectively use those multicultural opportunities in order to advance their own ideology, their own religious and political goals at the expense of the majority, and are pushing for the likes of Sharia law, are pushing for an Islamification of the country, and so therefore it hasn't worked. We have so many enclaves and ghettos in this country.
Well, this is the problem with multiculturalism, because it's not about having diversity, and people often conflate the two. Multiculturalism is an ideology that says every single grouping, every single religious belief system, every single political ideology has an equality in standing and in rightness and in moral goodness, which is patently false. We have all manner of ideologies in this world that are significantly inferior to others. We have the standard of the scriptures that God has given that is the definitive definition of righteousness. Anything that doesn't hold up to that is inferior. And yet multiculturalism has now, as a result, allowed us to believe everything. It has this progressive idea that truth is not objective, that it's fluid, it's created all sorts of identity issues across our society, and generally sees us give way to those particular viewpoints and perspectives that are actually not just inferior, they're dangerous and damaging.
Yeah. What concerns me as well on his website as well, and this is what he says. He says, 70 years ago, my political hero and former Labour Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin was pivotal to forming the alliance, which is NATO. He would have been delighted to see NATO grow larger over the years, with Germany, Poland and now Sweden all joining the most successful defence alliance in history. Now, to say that Ernest Bevin was one of his political heroes, when we look at his life and we look at his views and how he was during the Foreign Secretary from 1945 up until somewhere around 1950, is the fact that he was described as the most anti-Semitic minister probably in our nation's history. He actually deliberately prevented Holocaust survivors fleeing the horrors of Nazi Germany and the horrors of the Second World War, and refused them entry to enter the British Mandate of Palestine. He used the Royal Navy to board ships like the Exodus ships and storm those ships with the Holocaust survivors in them, and then to put Jewish people back into former concentration camps in Cyprus and then back in Hamburg in Germany, and is also his record on the Poles after the Second World War was terrible. So to say that the kind of worst years of British history during the Mandate years, from the end of the Second World War to Israel's rebirth of a modern state of Israel in 1948, were absolutely horrific.
Well, this shows us that not much has changed, okay, in the Labour Party as well. I'm reading an article here from June 13th, 1946, okay. This is Ernest Bevin. U.S. Zionist leaders charge Bevin with anti-Semitism at huge protest demonstration. And this is a direct quote. British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin was charged here tonight with having repeatedly given evidence of a virulent anti-Jewish bias. Was bitterly attacked for his statement on Palestine made earlier today at the annual convention of the British Labour Party, in which he said that the people of America insist on the admission of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. Remember, British Mandate Palestine. It's not talking about the so-called newer idea of a Palestinian state, because they do not want too many of them in New York. So this was how he was presenting it. The attacks voiced at a huge demonstration at Madison Square Garden called to protest British delay on the recommendation of the Anglo-American Inquiry Committee that 100,000 displaced Jews be admitted immediately into the land that we now call Israel. And so this was just one of those elements immediately after the Holocaust, where Bevin is accused of being an incredible anti-Semite. Lamy's hero.
Yeah, which could indicate the direction Labour goes under David Lamy.
It's interesting.
Foreign Office.
On the 9th of October, I attended a rally outside Downing Street. And David Lamy, they had representatives from all of the main political parties there. David Lamy represented Labour. And he gave what was a very good speech, although anyone with ears to hear would have noticed some moments of nuance and some moments where you could have read him on a couple of different ways. Someone I was with commented and they thought it was an absolutely brilliant speech, fantastic, really important, because there has been a lot of anti-Semitism by the Afro-Caribbean community in London towards Jews. There's a community shared essentially in Tottenham. And this was important possibly for that relationship and its improvement. Only a couple of days later, I said, watch, he's going to go away, and he's going to, within a few days, be appearing at a pro-Palestine event, and he'll be, calling for the immediate recognition, and will be calling for resistance from Israel in regard to their response, and saying they shouldn't really respond. Almost exactly what happened. He plays both sides. So it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, perhaps.
Absolutely. So let's see the direction that the Labour Party will, or the Labour government, I should say now, will actually take on our relations with the EU. As we know that under the Conservative Party, Britain had a vote on our referendum on our membership of the European Union in June 2016, and by majority the British people voted to leave the EU. So the new Foreign Secretary David Lamy has posted an article on the Foreign and Commonwealth website underlying the new foreign policy objectives of this new administration. And I'll just read out a bit of this one. He says it's time to reset Britain's relations with the EU. He says, as the new British Foreign Secretary with our Prime Minister Kier Stramer, this government will reset relations with Europe as a reliable partner, dependable ally and a good neighbour. Says this is why I'm travelling immediately to some of our key European partners to sit down with key leaders, and my message will be simple. Let us seize the opportunity for a reset, working even more closely together to tackle shared challenges. He said there are decisions that Kier Stramer wants to develop closer relations with the EU, and yet how much sovereignty will be yielded to the European Commission remains unknown for now. And I think this is the issue. It's very well talking about the fact that you want closer relations with our European partners, which is good. It's a natural thing for a government to actually want closer ties to our European neighbours, closer cooperation on many issues to do with defence and security, as well as business and trade. But the concerns are that we always know that the Labour Party always supported a position of remaining in the EU, except Jeremy Corbyn, who was a fierce Brexiteer. But also the fact that Kier Stramer has also voted and he put his position as being a Remainer. So the only way you can enter into a new trade agreement or a new agreement with the EU is to surrender more British sovereignty, to be under more influence of the European Union in order to do that. So the question is, what cost will Britain pay in order for us to have closer relations with the EU? And is this then a betrayal of Brexit?
Well, it does seem very definitely that there are factions within the Labour Party that desire to leave the EU and that would love to put this back on the table. Of course, they would find allies in the Lib Dems as well, and even probably a few Conservatives still, but fewer and fewer, I believe. Yeah, and fewer and fewer because there's not that many left, if we're being honest. So if Labour was to have, because of its super majority of 189 seats, if they were to have this put back on the table, there's nothing really to stop another referendum, or there's nothing really to stop them saying, actually, you know, scrap this, it's not working out, let's go back.
I mean, firstly, Starmer has actually said that last week, according to The Guardian, that he's ruling out rejoining the European single market in his lifetime by saying, I've been really clear about not joining the EU single market or customs union or return of freedom of movement. And said that Labour might desire to rejoin the EU, but we know that this is not going to happen during the life of this Parliament, primarily because this is the first time that the Labour Party have been in power for 14 years. They have a keystone policy agendas that they want to implement. And a new Labour government would waste too much political energy on trying to get us to rejoin the European Union. The only way they could do that would be to have another referendum, and the amount of division that would cause within the Labour Party as well as in the country after having won a huge mandate to actually govern would just really, the wheels of this administration would literally come off. So I think this is why he said that as of now, he has no plans to do any of that. But he is known to flip-flop his policies. But I can see that Britain would surrender huge amounts of sovereignty in a new EU agreement with the EU in order for closer cooperations between Britain and the EU. And effectively, we would still probably be in the EU, but all but in name.
It's an interesting point. We have to remember that Labour did only win around 35% of the public vote, and that's with a turnout of, I think it was only about 60%. So we actually had very low voter turnout. We had this massively low number. Fewer people voted for Sir Kier Stramer than voted for Jeremy Corbyn when Corbyn lost to Johnson in 2019. So we can't forget those elements.
It's 2%. Yeah. He's just increased Labour's vote across the board by only 2%.
Correct.
But what they've been very good at is being able to target the key marginal seats that has transferred from, of course, votes into more seats, and this has given Labour a massive majority. The role I think the Reform Party has played and had an impact on the Conservative Party has also reduced massively the number of Conservative seats. Had that not been the case, I think the Labour victory would have been a lot smaller than what it was. We've also seen the collapse of the SNP pretty much in Scotland, only winning 9 seats, losing 38 seats. That's played a major role. So, but I think what country or what nation or what government can effectively survive the COVID-19 restrictions and dealing with the global pandemic, and of course the British people were going to vote them out. But in terms of China, now China has been recognised as kind of the biggest threat, not only to British security but also to European and Western security. And so the Labour Party and new government would say it would undertake a full audit across all government departments of the UK's relationship with China to set the direction course of China's policy, Lamy told reporters last week. Starmer last year said that the UK needed to wean itself off China on issues like trade and commerce and technology, while acknowledging the importance of being able to cooperate on such issues as tackling climate change. The challenge will be to balance UK's trade and economic interests with security imperatives. That could complicate things with a possible Donald Trump moving into office. I suppose the interesting thing is that with China, you can say that the President Trump before raised the concerns and the threat of China. This was pretty much ignored. We know that there are investigations, or had been investigations, which identify the fact that we saw that the COVID-19 global pandemic was leaked from the lab in Wuhan, and that's backed up by various other security services that suggest that, and reports have gone out, and yet China hasn't had to pay a price. China's infrastructure, technological infrastructure, is intertwined with our own nations. We are dependent upon China for our manufacturing base, and yet they're using this as a weapon against us. So it seems that China is the emerging superpower that is not democratic. There's a totalitarian regime, and we know that Christians are being persecuted in the most horrific way, and the Muslim population, the Uyghurs, are in concentration camps.
Yeah, and it's for this reason that I think what we can see is with a rise of the right wing across Europe and likely a return to right wing control with a likely Republican victory in the forthcoming US election, is increased pressure on this government, this Labour government, to be very clear and to get it right in relation to China. And this is one area that I feel they won't be overly controversial in their opinion or in they're taking it seriously. I think they will recognize this has been a threat. They may even surprise people and take it more seriously than the previous government, which we can't forget that in the past few years there have been repeated uncoverings of spies and whatnot in the halls of Westminster. That's very, very important. But we have to put this in that broader context. You mentioned threat to the entirety of the West. Let's talk about the FBI director's stark warning about China's cyber hack to wreak havoc. Here's a special report.
It was just 1 year ago that the U.S. shot down a Chinese spy balloon, gathering intelligence as it passed over U.S. military bases. FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress a major China cyber attack would prove much more damaging.
China's hackers are positioning on American infrastructure in preparation to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities if and when China decides the time has come to strike.
Ray's testimony came on the same day U.S. officials announced they had blocked a sophisticated Chinese cyber spy operation called Volatile. The cyber team reportedly hijacked information from hundreds of small U.S. businesses. The director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency explains what a perfectly executed infrastructure hack would mean for the average American.
Telecommunications going down so people can't use their cell phone. People start getting sick from polluted water. Trains get derailed. Air traffic control system, port control systems are malfunctioning. This is truly an everything, everywhere, all at once scenario.
Director Ray believes it is the defining threat of our generation.
Let's be clear. Cyber threats to our critical infrastructure represent real-world threats to our physical safety.
Cybersecurity experts say China's hackers are constantly testing the security of U.S. computer servers, often breaking through firewalls to steal valuable corporate and personal information. Former White House Cyber Response Chief Jeff Green says China's goal is to create chaos.
The goal of these intrusions is largely to create that societal panic, and we need to make sure that we are prepared not to panic. We take the power away from our adversaries when we can take a punch, roll with it, and move forward.
One proposed solution: more congressional funding to update and safeguard antiquated U.S. computer networks.
These intrusions are happening because of fundamental flaws in devices that these critical infrastructure services are using. So you as an individual can't do a lot to protect the critical infrastructure, but you can help prepare yourself.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Our special guest joining us on Behind Headlines is Michael McCann, former director of Israel-Britain Alliance and a Labour MP. And I couldn't think of anyone better to interview again on how British foreign policy will look under our new Labour government. Well, Michael, it's an absolute pleasure that you can join us from Glasgow again, 2 weeks in a row. Your expertise is absolutely invaluable, particularly when we discuss the direction that the Labour Party will take in terms of foreign policy. But before we talk about that, what are your thoughts on the fact that the Labour Party won 411 seats? That was up 209 seats from their total from the last election back in 2019. And we saw the total collapse of the Conservative Party. Just give us an overview of what you think about the results of this year's general election that took place on Thursday, the 4th of July.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't make any criticism of the voting system for the next part of my answer, Simon, because I believe that first past the post, where there's a link between the politician and the local community, is the best way that we can organise politics in the UK, particularly when you look at other countries like France and America in terms of how their electoral systems work. But I think the real thing is that numbers don't lie. Labour received 36% of the popular vote, but got a huge majority in Parliament. And I think that it was all fairly predictable. Reform squeezed the Tory vote. There was a general apathy about Labour. This was not a repeat of 1997. And yet we have a party in power who can do so much, should they choose to do so, for good and ill, with such a massive majority. But I think the Conservatives will have to look at internally the problems that they have. They're going to have to pick someone as a leader that's going to have to face down not only a Labour government with a huge majority, but look to the future, because I don't think it's inevitable that we're going to have a Labour government for 10 years or 15 years. I think that's up to how good they choose to be. But in terms of the other political parties, the development of reform and where the Conservatives go will be crucial for the future of our country.
And Michael, what are some of the main goals of the new government's foreign policy over this next Parliament?
Well, I would like to think it would be steady as you go, so that the UK would continue to support Ukraine militarily, both with the expertise and hardware. But I also think that the Labour Party has to contend with a group of MPs within their ranks who are pro-Russia. They've kept a low profile, but they're most certainly pro-Russia. That includes the people like John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, and of course another cadre of younger hard left MPs who are part of that structure. So they're going to have to contend with that. In terms of other issues, I think they'll be, at the start at the very least, fairly pragmatic. I think they will attempt to continue the relationship we have with the United States of America. I think they will increasingly call for Israel to restrain itself in terms of the conflicts it has with Hamas, but also what everyone predicts is going to be a forthcoming conflict with Hezbollah, obviously all backed by the Iranians. But they've got a fundamental problem because they have put in place David Lamy as the Foreign Secretary, and you'll recall maybe from previous conversations that I'm not convinced that he'll be there for very long. Douglas Alexander, who is by far the most experienced Labour politician within the ranks of Parliament, has been appointed as a more junior business minister after being absent from the House of Commons for 9 years. And I think ultimately, when David Lamy makes a blunder, and David Lamy will make a blunder, then he will be replaced.
Looking at his, he posted an article on the Foreign and Commonwealth website outlining his vision and the vision of the Labour Party for Britain and British interests. What alarmed me was the fact that he describes his political hero as being Ernest Bevin, who was Foreign Secretary from 1945 up until, was it 1950? And literally he was a raving anti-Semite. He prevented Holocaust survivors, particularly the story of the Exodus ship, from entering into the British Mandate of Palestine when they had nowhere else to go, put Jewish people back in almost like concentration-like conditions in Germany and Hamburg, and the Labour Party's treatment of the whole mandate years from 45 to 48 was absolutely horrific, but also found out the Labour Party allowed the Soviets to effectively kill Polish war heroes because they were concerned that the Poles wanted their freedom and wanted an independent state, but they had a close relationship with the Soviet Union. So what are your thoughts on David Lamy's political hero being Ernest Bevin?
Well, if you look at the history of Ernest Bevin, it's a mixed history. There's reports that he was anti-Semitic, and there are other reports saying that he wasn't. But what we do know is that he was very much tied to the Foreign Office ethos of being pro-Arab. And a lot of his decision-making, including the delayed decision to recognise the State of Israel, which, for example, the Russians and Americans did within days of the new State of Israel being declared on the 14th of May 1948. Britain, still a leading power at that time in the world, still had the empire, dragged their heels. So, and he was in charge of that. And all the history and all the records seem to show that there was a real deep-rooted problem within the Foreign Office. There was a conflicting report that when he met a guy called Joseph Linton, who was the de facto Israeli ambassador to the UK before there was official recognition, the relationship warmed. But this is, David Lamy is a classic example of someone who can't help but put his foot in it, because he would have time to have thought about that article, what he was going to say in it, who he would name check in it, but he chooses to name check someone who has a checkered history rather than someone who perhaps had a better track record in terms of world politics and diplomacy. I think the problem with David Lamy is he always feels under pressure to say the thing that the interviewer or the person speaking to him wants to hear. And that can't be the case when you're dealing with foreign affairs and diplomacy. I think that he'll attempt to keep under control those tendencies, but ultimately I think he will fail. And I think that the difference is he's been given a chance by Kier Stramer. If you look at Emily Thornberry, who was to be the Attorney General, he's recognised that she isn't capable of doing that job, and he's appointed someone from outside. In terms of David Lamy, when he decides David Lamy can't do the job, and I would suggest that that's a when, not an if, then he's got a natural replacement with a very highly articulate, intelligent individual who's currently doing a pretty low-level job in the business department, Douglas Alexander.
Of great importance also is Britain's relationship with the EU, and David Lamy has spoken of how he desires under a Labour government for that relationship between Britain and the EU to be reset. Now, Starmer has said, he's ruled out any rejoining, but he could change his mind. What are your thoughts on our relationship to the EU under this new government?
Well, I think it would be reckless if they attempted to rejoin so swiftly after the British people have decided that they wanted to leave the European Union. But there's no doubt that they'll want to forge closer relationships with European countries. That's why David Lamy's first overseas trek was across the pond to visit our neighbours in Europe. And they will try to forge the best possible partnership that they can within the confines of Brexit. Who knows what they'll have to give up to make that relationship, as far as they can see, better. But ultimately, Starmer knows that if they actually try and turn on the head a decision, a democratic decision, which was made by the people of our country, they will be in deep, deep trouble.
Michael, which is a close issue that's close to my heart, it's close to your heart and our viewers' heart as well, is the whole Starmer's approach to foreign policy in the Middle East. So the Telegraph reported only a few days ago that he said that a Palestinian state is undeniable right in the peace process. The recognition of the state of Palestine as part of a Middle East peace process is undeniable right, after he spoke to Mahmoud Abbas, talking about a two-state solution, possibly also the prospect that a Labour government might actually recognise the International Criminal Court's ruling in The Hague to bring prosecutions against the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister for alleged war crimes in Gaza. Just share with us your concerns in this direction, and is he heavily being influenced by the Islamists within his party and the hard left?
That will be part of his thinking, but the Labour Party, as you will well know, Simon, has always been closer to that side of the political debate between Israel and the Palestinians than they have been to the Israelis. The Conservative government was always, in my opinion, had a relationship with Israel which said, when they spoke to them privately, they said, listen, we are your best friends, don't need to worry about our relationship with you. But then in public, they were trying to preserve the relationships they had with Arabic countries by preserving all the different deals that they have in place to secure trade. So there was always that difficult balancing act for the Conservatives. Labour's different. They have got a cadre of MPs who, quite frankly, many of them do not want Israel to exist at all. And that's what he has to control. Now, we saw it after the 7th of October attacks. It wasn't very long before the Labour backbenches started to raise their voices and say that we should be condemning Israel for the actions it was taking in defence of its country. Those same voices are going to be prevalent again, and that's the honeymoon period is going to take place. It will last over the summer, no doubt. How long it lasts thereafter will be interesting to see. But the bottom line is he's got a major problem keeping those backbenches under control. And for some of those people, I don't think he will be able to keep them under control. And incidentally, that includes his Foreign Secretary, David Lamy.
So, Michael, we just want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines today. Thank you so much for your insight and expertise. We really appreciate the fact. And it's a shame that you are no longer a member of Parliament, because we need good people in the House of Commons with moral conviction, moral courage, who knows the difference between right and wrong, and are willing not only to stand up for British interests on the world stage, but also to stand up for our special relationship and friendship with the nation of Israel, which is vital to this country's destiny, but also vital for this nation's spiritual health. So we just appreciate you very much, and thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Again, really thankful to Michael McCann for a very helpful insight there. and a great deal, wealth of experience that he has brought to the program the past couple of weeks on this particular election front and the kind of post-mortem of what's happened in the past week. Now, another element that we need to discuss is the European security threat posed by Russia. China is one thing. Russia is very closely attached to China. In fact, we're increasingly, we've talked on the program before, seeing almost another axis of evil as such that's arising, which includes Russia. The UK has been one of Kiev's staunchest supporters and has provided money, weapons and troop training to help it repel Russia's invasion. Labour has stressed continued support for Ukraine if it wins. They did win, so we'll see them presumably continue with that support. Starmer is expected to meet President Vladimir Zelensky early to reaffirm that message in person. Starmer has said a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin is simply not an issue at the moment and described him as the aggressor in Ukraine. The most immediate of the challenges that's facing Starmer and Labour seems to be Ukraine, and he says, "We will stand by the brave people of Ukraine as they defend their freedom against Vladimir Putin's new form of fascism. British military, economic, political and diplomatic support for Ukraine will remain ironclad."
So really this is a continuation of conservative British foreign policy towards Ukraine and dealing with the kind of Russian threat posed by Europe. So I don't think we see any change in that one. It's very similar to that of the Democrats under Biden as well. There isn't the speculation of how we deal with this, but also ideologically though, this poses a challenge as well for the new Labour government, that there will be many of those who are elected to Parliament to represent the Labour Party who are of the political left or even the hard left, whose natural orientation is to Russia, the birthplace of Marxism, the birthplace of the 1917 communist revolution, to the Trotskyites, to that ideology. So in a sense, this is a kind of natural home for them, is Russia. So I don't know whether we're going to see this as a major flare-up in the coming years, the close relationship between the British government and the Ukrainian government and expelling Putin and that Russian influence. But of course, this is directly in line with policies of the EU, the direction of NATO, the US administration and the former Conservative government.
Well, the now thrice removed Prime Minister Boris Johnson was incredibly and remains incredibly popular among Ukrainians, and it's interesting to observe and to hear, and will be interesting in coming days to see more of how Ukrainians respond to this new government. You're exactly right, and Michael shared in our interview just a few moments ago that there are people within the Labour Party who are explicitly pro-Russia. So they've been keeping a fairly low profile. Now that they're in that place of control and power, we'll see where it goes. But the general sense is that Russia's invasion was barbaric. It's made clear the need to do more to strengthen our own defenses. And so next week, the Prime Minister, Defense Secretary, we have there David Lamy speaking, will travel to Washington for the NATO summit.
No, absolutely. And also on NATO, this is what he says, that Russia's barbaric invasion has made clear the need for us to do more to strengthen our own defences. Next week, the Prime Minister obviously is going to be visiting NATO for the NATO summit that's in Washington. And this is what he says. This government's commitment to the alliance is unshakable, just as it was in Bevin's time. I'll be discussing this weekend how NATO allies can go further in investing in our tightly connected defence industries and providing Ukraine with its own clear path to joining our alliance. Now, that was the big debate, whether Ukraine should be able to join NATO or not. And I think a lot of NATO military personnel felt that this was not a sensible course to do, as it creates more antagonism with the Russians. But also in this one, it says, alongside security, we want to do more together to bring prosperity to our continent. None of us can address the urgency of none of us can address the urgency of climate change emergency alone. We need a coordinated global action. This is particularly important in Europe, whose energy networks are so closely connected. Together, we must invest all industries of the future and deliver sustained economic growth for all. So here we go. I think we do start to see in David Lamy's article on the direction that British foreign policy would take under the control of a Labour government. So they're interested in kind of globalism, coordinated global action, which is signifying that this will be a globalist led administration with globalist ideals to tackle climate change. And of course, we know that one of the biggest problems that Europe has been facing is that European nations have been following the disastrous policy of zero carbon net emissions. Now, if, for example, that this Labour government continues in that line, then it means that our own populations become poorer and poorer. And yet the reality is this won't make hardly any single difference to reducing carbon zero net emissions or making the planet a greener planet.
Yeah, this is exactly what we need to be considering and looking at in coming days. And I think Labour is going to have to kind of get a grip on and accurately, honestly assess the situation, the idea of obtaining net zero and these particular conditions economically as well in this context of a world very much at war with itself.
Reagan, you mentioned at the intro to Behind the Headlines tonight that David Lamy, our new Foreign Secretary, has a new term to describe British foreign policy, and it's called progressive realism. So it'd be good to know what that actually means, if David Lamy knows what it means himself or anyone else. But he says that he wrote an essay in the Foreign Affairs magazine that outlines the case for progressive realism. This, he says, is underpinning on how the next Labour government will deliver our goals of Britain reconnected, as if Britain was isolated in the first place. He says that progressive realism advocates using realist means to pursue progressive ends. He says for British government, that requires tough-minded honesty about the United Kingdom, the balance of power and the state of the world. But instead of using the logic of realism solely to articulate power, progressive realism uses it in the service of just goals. For example, climate change, defending a democracy, and advocating the world's economic development. It is the pursuit of ideals without discussions about what is achievable. Now, you're an intelligent guy. Did you make any sense of what progressive realism actually means from this statement that David Lamy's written? Because
no,
I don't have a clue.
No, but you cannot be a realist and be honest, because I look at realism, what he's talking about is being honest about where we're at and adopt some of the progressive agendas that they're espousing in any category. And yeah, you're exactly right. This is a lot of buzz speak. It's very inflated. Take this to Tottenham, Lamy's constituency, and see if anyone can explain what on earth he's talking about. And indeed, if they were to understand, if anyone approves of it. Because I guarantee you, even though a large number of people would have voted for Lamy in Tottenham, a lot of what he stands for, they don't go along with.
But also what's interesting as well, it's very good to talk about kind of pursuing progressive ends, closer relationship with our European partners. Now, if we look at what's happening politically on the continent of Europe, the Italians have shifted to a Eurosceptic position. So have the Germans. We have a very anti-EU government in the Netherlands. And also we're seeing that France is turning to the political extremes, so there's no real allies. So, and particularly if Trump wins the US presidential election in November, we're going to find that the Labour Party's only kind of globalist ally will be Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. So I don't know how effectively that will last. But on the issue of Israel, this is what he says. He says, in the face of conflict in the Middle East, in the short term, we urgently need an immediate ceasefire, compiled with both sides, the immediate return of all the hostages held by Hamas terrorists, and for Israel, the lift of unacceptable restrictions on aid flows and to enable massive surge of supplies into Gaza.
Well, Let's look now at this special report from our friends at CBN.
The terror group's missiles, rockets, and drones set fires on the Golan Heights and near the Sea of Galilee. Hezbollah launched the barrage after Israel assassinated one of its top commanders, whose ultimate goal was to conquer Jerusalem. Hezbollah is promising more attacks.
The series of responses is ongoing and will continue targeting new sites the enemy never imagined would be hit.
The ongoing assault could lead Israel to launch an all-out war on Hezbollah to enable some 80,000 residents who've been evacuated to return to northern Israel.
We know there is still a long way to go, but we are determined to restore security to the north and return the residents safely to their homes.
As war inches closer, both Hezbollah and its patron Iran are threatening to obliterate Israel. Netanyahu issuing this strong response.
We established a principle. Whoever harms us is marked for death. We put it into practice.
As for the ongoing conflict in Gaza, Turkey's president says Israel must be forced to end the war.
To end this destruction, Israel must be stopped and forced to accept a permanent ceasefire.
To that end, a number of Arab nations are seeking to isolate Israel by moving to freeze its participation in the United Nations.
A step like this step is what ended, brought down, and eliminated a colonial regime in South Africa.
In the meantime, Hamas has made amendments to a proposed ceasefire deal that could free many of the hostages now held captive in Gaza. The changes were enough to get Israel to send a negotiating team to renewed ceasefire talks. But there are conflicting reports on whether Hamas is ready to agree to a deal without a permanent end to the fighting and all Israeli troops out of Gaza. According to a New York Times report that cited unnamed sources, a number of top IDF generals are ready to give up the war on Hamas if it means freeing the hostages. Netanyahu is blasting the report.
I don't know who those unnamed parties are, but I'm here to make it unequivocally clear. It won't happen.
On July 4th, Netanyahu sent greetings and a message to the U.S. At their base, Israel and America are guided by the same twin insights. Freedom is the most precious gift humanity will ever know, and freedom isn't free. You have to be willing to fight for it.
So we know that this new Labour administration will have to deal with the Middle East and form British foreign policy to the region, knowing that if Israel goes to war against Hezbollah in the north, then the Iranians have said that they will attack Israel on a multi-front war, which will lead to a regional war in the Middle East that then could extend to a global world war. I mean, we've seen the Labour Party come out, and Starmer said it, David Lamy has said it, that they support a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, and this is a reward for Hamas's terror activities on October the 7th. They're calling for unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. But we've also had David Lamy actually then support the International Criminal Court in The Hague that wants to bring war crimes against the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, his defense minister, for Israel's actions in Gaza, and put that on the same kind of moral platform as the leaders of Hamas. So that is a massive warning alarm signal, I think, goes off regarding that one. But we also know, for example, that the Labour Party will be indebted to many of the Muslim community's votes that ensured their victory on the 4th of July. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out on Labour's foreign policy towards Israel. But isn't it important that we recognise that our nation will be blessed or cursed depending on how our nation blesses or curses Israel? And if the Labour Party pushes for a recognition of a unilateral Palestinian state, this is not going to bring a blessing on our nation and would spell turbulence in our relationship with the nation of Israel. And our government would then be siding with the enemies of Israel.
And that includes to some degree Iran, because this is the other massive issue that they're going to need to get a handle on, and they're unlikely to rush into prescribing Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and will instead examine whether a new category of state-backed terrorism needs to be devised. Lamy has is going to be consulting colleagues on the implications for Iranian foreign policy of the election at the weekend of reformist-backed President Masoud Pezeshkian. An issue for the West is testing, either through private talks in Oman or more public dialogue, whether the new Iranian president has any real influence on foreign policy and wants to take steps to dial down Iran's nuclear program, which would make it possible for sanctions to be eased.
Right, so in summing up, as we're coming to the end of the programme, I think a Labour government will pursue a more of a globalist agenda. They will put policies of wokeness and multiculturalism at the centre of British foreign policy, but also they will want to strengthen their position with the EU, which could mean that our nation succeeds more sovereignty to that of the European Union, and also the fact that the warning comes in our relationship with Israel by calling and recognising a Palestinian state. This is certainly to bring a curse from the Lord upon our nation. And I'll let you close the programme. Thank you, Reagan.
Well, this is what we're experiencing. This is what we need to be praying about. The scriptures call us to pray for all those who are in authority, as every government has been given by God. And that's both for blessing and for cursing. That's both so that the nation can be blessed as it lives in righteousness, and also so that it can be judged. Time will tell where we're at here, but we need to be praying for our nation. And that's my appeal to you, our viewers, that you would continue to uphold David Lamy, the Foreign Secretary, that you would uphold the Labour government in your prayers, and ask that God's will would be done in power. Let's ask that God would work in and through them for His glory. God bless you all.